Hi, welcome to another episode of Django Chat, a podcast on the Django Web Framework. I'm Will Vincent, joined by Carlton Gibson. Hello, Carlton.
Hello, Will.
This week, we're very pleased to have Nick Janetakis join us to talk about Flask, Docker, programming. Welcome to the show, Nick.
Hey, thanks a lot for having me. And well done on the last name. Many people don't get it right. You nailed it.
Well, I've taken your courses and listened to your podcast. We could just plug that right now, Running in Production, which has a number of things on Django, actually, but you're not limited to just Django on it. That's correct, right?
Yep, correct. Although at this point, I think half the episodes are Django.
Yeah. Well, I think so we'll just dive into it. So I think we first met because I took your Dive into Docker course after reading, well, you have a lot of Docker stuff back when I was learning that, and I found that to be an excellent resource. And then I think you actually approached me about the podcast, right? Because you were thinking about the podcast. And then I see that you've done, I think, more episodes than we have in like half the time. So you found a way to be prolific. But maybe if you could just talk about the podcast, why do it and kind of what are the topics that you cover? Because it's different than this one.
Yeah, so the Running in Production podcast, it just focuses on talking to someone new every week. And we just go over their basic tech stack, like how they built their application, how they deploy it, lessons learned, best tips. But we do get into the woods a little bit when it comes to developing the application itself, right? Like we go over what framework they have, like what libraries they use to help build that type of application. So hopefully, there's some value out there for listeners where, it's sort of entertainment, but at the same time, you might learn a new tool or go research something so you can try it out in your own stuff and kind of just see how it works overall for other folks. Because there's a big mix of, individuals who are just deploying their first application, maybe on Heroku or something like that. But on the other, side of the spectrum, there's like people like Dropbox where they're handling like, 1 billion requests per second and have been around for whatever, like 13 years. Yeah,
I saw you had the Dropbox one came out recently. They're using still, is it pylons? Or they started with pylons, right?
Yeah, that took me for, threw me off a little bit because, the project is so old, not in like a bad way, but, pylons was the hotness back then. So that's kind of why they chose that one. But I think it's a really strong testament to maybe the web framework doesn't matter that much, right? It's like you just build up your own core, code that you like for whatever business domain you're in. And while the framework is important, helps you out, et cetera. But for like a really big project that's like a long-term one, then it looks like pretty much anything goes.
We're turning web requests into web responses, right? And there's only so much that needs to happen when you do that. All the frameworks kind of very similar when you get right down to that job.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say, right, Carlton, as the Django fellow, a lot of what he and Marius and the team work on is security and bug fixes, which you need to be Dropbox sized to manage that yourself if you have a custom framework. That's, one of the things that if you stay within the rails of, say, Django, you get for free. So I would think that's did you talk about that with the Dropbox folks? Like how they, because every month there's a new security or bug fix or a couple within Django. So if you roll your own framework, you have to do that yourself.
Yeah, for sure. No, we didn't get too deep into like how they manage security patches and whatnot, but that is definitely a really good point. And, I'm not advocating like, hey, just use whatever you want or roll your own framework from scratch, because there's a lot of value in using Django or Flask or whatever, just because, you don't need to think about those problems, especially if you're at a smaller scale. Just starting out, it's a great thing to have.
Yeah. So I want to ask you a lot about Flask because you have a course on Flask and Flask is going through some changes with 2.0, I think is out or is about to be out. But we always like to ask guests, how did you get into programming? How did you get to where you are today? As much or little detail as you like. And then I'd love to ask you a bunch of stuff about Flask.
Okay. So this show is, you say, about 1 hour long. So we can focus the whole hour on that, I think, because, but no, I guess like the super TLDR version is started programming in the very late 1990s, was really into video games, especially Quake, and ended up just developing my own web application around that with a couple of friends. Like we built a competitive gaming ladder. And that was my intro to programming. From there, it was like such a big mixture of different languages back then because it was like classic ASP to PHP to just not using any frameworks, right? Like just a standard library. Then I did that for a whole bunch of many years, and then eventually learned about WordPress, then eventually learned about Rails, then eventually learned about Flask, and here we are present day. So I've been using Flask since about 2014, just to give some timeline on where we're at.
Can I ask why did you switch to Python and Flask? What did it do for you that the Rails and the other frameworks hadn't?
So it's interesting because I still do some client work now. So I am like a freelance developer where I kind of do still write Rails, but I also write Flask apps as well, even some other languages too, like Phoenix and Elixir. But yeah, I mean, I went from, so like WordPress is basically like, one of the highest levels you can get at, right? It's like just point click, user admin, drop in some plugins, do whatever. So I was finding myself that, well, there's a lot of things that I just don't have control over. And I looked at some of the plugin code that other developers wrote, and it's like, not like ragging on them, but that was like not something I wanted to deal with. So when I started to get more complicated client work, like, building a SaaS app, etc., I just wanted to start writing my own code to do that. And initially I started with Rails, and that definitely worked out very well for me. But when I ended up transitioning over to Python, and why I specifically chose Flask, like maybe instead of Django, or just moving to Python and Flask in general, I think it's just it's the Zen of Python, right? The main one that really stuck out to me was, and I don't want to misquote it, but it was around like, there should only be one preferable way to do something, like the obvious way to do it. And Ruby is sort of kind of the opposite of that. Not to say that's a bad thing, but, Ruby gives you a lot of sharp knives. Like you can write the same thing 8 different times, and maybe one looks more beautiful than the other, but that's all like subjective stuff to some extent. So I really liked with Python where I just felt like I can read other people's code much, much easier. And at the end of the day, like that's a big deal for me because then, it makes it easier to jump into other people's code, see what's going on, open PRs, understand it better, and then ultimately write better code that I can maintain and understand like 6 months later.
So we're biased, but I would say that the extension of that is Django over Flask in that, Django being a full-bodied framework as opposed to a micro framework. When I look at Flask projects, I see way more diversity of structure and packages than I do within Django. So I guess the question would be for you with client work, like how disparate are Flask projects that you jump into? Like, are there kind of default best practices that you see? Or, I mean, it is a micro framework, so you have much more options and responsibility when you're, wiring it up.
Yeah, so you're definitely right in that front. Like, with Rails and Django specifically, you get so much out of the box, so many guidelines to work with. Not guidelines in a bad way, that you don't need to just think about like, oh, where should, my models go, or where should my templating stuff go? But yeah, with Flask, I'm finding it's pretty much all over the place. But I feel like you can gravitate towards things that are considered best practices, I guess. So, but it's mainly like a learning process to get there, where it's like one more thing you need to think about, basically.
Yeah. So you're the Flask course that you have, a video course, you build a very full-bodied SaaS app. I guess how have you learned, the best practices that you then teach to others? Like, were there certain open source apps you saw that worked well, or like, what was that process for you that you now distill, for others?
Right. Yeah. It's interesting when it comes to best practices, because it's like, they're not set in stone. Like no one just says like, these are the best practices, therefore everyone should do this and everyone else is wrong. Like it's kind of just like things I don't know, at least for me, right? It's like things you just figure out as you go. Like you might do something wrong 5 times, but it's not wrong because it's like incorrect. It's wrong because, well, I'm struggling with this specific pattern, but when I move it to this way, it's like, oh, that's like kind of nice. And then you grow into the best practices over time. So when it came to creating that Flask course, the Build a SaaS App with Flask one, I had already built a few different SaaS apps for a couple of different people. And I found myself going over the same patterns. And I'm like, well, while I like doing the freelance work, like, wouldn't it be neat if I can just like automate myself out of the job and kind of just like make a course around that sort of. And I took all those, quote unquote best practices that I've learned along the way. And then I just started building up a course and, incrementally breaking down the final product into something you can actually build like step by step.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's patterns, isn't it? You find yourself doing the same thing. Oh, I've done this before. Oh yeah. Okay. If I structure it this way, that works. If I structure it the other way, it's a bit more fiddly. And so you go with what works.
Yeah, for sure.
So not that you are the Flask community, but I have questions about that since, we are a Django podcast. And my sense is I know some of the people in the Flask community, but, where do you go for questions? Where do you direct, people who take your course? Like, is there a central hub? So Django has this forum, .Django project and conferences, but Flask isn't as developed in that sense, is my sense.
Yeah. So usually for like just general help, like let's say you need to ask a question, if you can't find it when Googling and you need to speak to a human being or want to, then it's usually IRC or Discord, where there's, a couple hundred people on the IRC channel and I think thousands in the Discord channel. Honestly, I just use the IRC directly because there's, there's like a bot that relays the chat from Discord to IRC. but it's pretty active there. Like, you can ask a question and pretty much we'll get a response within minutes most of the time, unless it's like, Sunday morning at like 6 a.m.
Yeah, there was Django has all the same things. And there was actually just a discussion around Freenode and that whole thing and Libra. And there's lots of different areas. I mean, with Django, all those. And then there's also, I'm sure, I don't know, Carlton. There's the Django developers list, and Google Groups.
Freenode to Libra chat, moved all the, I don't know what went down at Freenode, but something strange happened. All of a sudden it was, we're up and off after 12 years in the same place. And then what do we have? We've got the forum and we've got the mailing lists as well. Yeah. So no.
But there was a discussion about, do we keep the IRC? So the way Django is structured, there's 200 or so individual members who get voted in, and they kind of decide where things go. And so that was where the discussion happened. There was a dozen or 2 dozen emails around, hey, something's come up. And, so that seems more structured than Flask, but it's fairly
I don't know
unstructured.
The Flask community at all. I know Armin who wrote it and David Lord who is the big maintainer. But then beyond that, I don't know the ecosystem at all.
Right. I think in general, though, with Python, we are very fortunate in that most of the web programming problems are sort of kind of solved. So I find myself being able to just Google most problems and honestly just find really, really good answers, either through Stack Overflow or individual blog posts that folks wrote. And then also certain libraries are just very well documented.
Yeah.
Like
I think that's one of the advantages of using a established thing, right? If you Google it, it'll be on, there'll be a Stack Overflow thing with 500 upvotes. That's the answer to your problem. And yes, that's what I needed. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So Flask has a 2.0 update coming out, which I believe is going to add async. Or could you just generally speak to some of the changes that are coming in Flask? Or again, because we don't know much about the Flask world.
Right. So 2.0 shipped, I think, I don't want to say exact days because I don't know, but it was like May 12th, the 13th, 2021. So it already came out at the time of recording this. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of different quality of life features there. And it like around async and just route decorator syntax, like convenience things. I haven't gotten super deep into the async stuff, so I don't know how much we're going to be able to talk about that one. But I know there is async in Django as well. And correct me if I'm wrong here, because really I don't know that much about the async stuff, but don't you need every part of your stack to be async compatible to get the benefits out of that? Like your database adapter, like ORM, et cetera, or no?
No. It's a good question. So if you want like the full massive, I'm going to get the most out of my single thread by handling it async throughput, you need everything to be fully async compatible. But what Django's done is, I think really there's two phases of it. There's within WSGI where you can define a single view handler as async def, and within that, and it will be wrapped in a coroutine and an async in the event loop, and it will be dispatched, and that'll work. And you don't have to do anything else. You can use that. And I think that's really exciting because say you want to make, 2 or 3 parallel HTTP requests and then combine them to put together your response. You can get that kind of concurrency going without any big changes. And then we also have the ASCII side of it, which is the async standard, like WSGI was the Python standard for web application servers. Well, ASCII is the asynchronous version of that. So we have ASCII compatibility, and when it gets down to an ORM operation, it runs it in a thread loop executor. So you're not going to get the full throughput there with Django just yet, because we haven't got the ORM compatibility just yet. That's coming, and that will evolve. But I think what's nice is the ability to sprinkle in a little bit of async. That's the first bit, and then over time, if you really need high throughput, then you've got to be careful what middleware you're using. Are your middleware all properly asynchronous? Are you using the ORM? If you are, well, you've got to really think carefully about what you're doing there, because that's not asynchronous. But slowly. I'm interested with what's Flask has been doing, because there was another framework. It's totally slipped my mind. Began with Q, that was like an experiment one, and that's been merged into Flask or something. Is that right? Do you know about that?
I don't know if it's going to be merged in, but I believe the name of that one is Quartz.
Yeah, and it's kind of influenced the development of Flask.
Yeah, I remember seeing a reference to that in the new Flask 2 docs, but yeah, I'm just not super into that. But it sounds like without needing the whole stack to be async compatible, you can still get pretty good wins just out of the box, like at least on the Django side of things.
Yeah, I mean,
without, yeah.
I mean, it's exciting times. And, obviously if throughput on a single thread is your, sine qua non, then you have to go for a, async framework like Starlet or whatever and be fully in that world. But I think for the vast majority of cases, we don't need that, right? And so it's what can we add in? And Django's got a long way to go because it's not just about adding async compatibility. It's about adding Django, a Django-like API, right? It's like where you can define some views and, it's nicely declarative and then it just kind of works in the right way. We're a long way from that, I think, still. But that's fine. That's, yeah.
Yeah, but it's not an all or nothing thing, right? Which is nice, is that it's being, because so ASCII was added to 3.0, 3.1 had views, and then models in the ORM is the, was there another one, views, and was there a second one?
No, the view, so 3.0 added ASCII support, right? And you could run with an ASCII server, but it was kind of foundational for something. There's no real benefit to that at all. With 3.1 and the view layer being async compatible, that was kind of a nice addition in that you can define these async def views just within your WSGI environment, or you can run a full ASCII pipeline down to the view. The next phase, the one that will really change everything, I think, is getting async down to the ORM. I think that will enable a whole different. Because at the moment, let me give you a concrete example. You can have an async view, say, but let's say you want the request.user. You want to access the session. Well, in Django, request.user comes from the database, and so the middleware, the session middleware that populates the session, has to be wrapped in a thread executor. And because of the way database connections aren't thread safe, they're not async aware. All those database connections have to essentially be done on the main thread, on a single main thread. So essentially, it's not concurrent whilst you're accessing the ORM. Essentially, it's still single threaded, and that's a real blocker. So as soon as we can get a proper story there at the ORM level, then the potential to increase the throughput becomes, much higher.
Let me ask you a question about that one. So I guess I'm a fan of like sprinkling in async when needed without necessarily using an async framework. But like if I want to execute something in the background, typically I would just reach for using Celery. And for example, like if I wanted to, send an email out, right? Like over SendGrid or, some transactional email service. What's interesting about Celery, at least, is like you get these benefits out of the box, like being able to do retries, based on various rules that you can set up. You get some pretty good, insight of, how things are going. But if you execute something like that in an async view, do you lose all of those benefits without rolling your own code on top of that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's really for that kind of case. You're still going to want a queuing system for background tasks, right? Async isn't, Starlet's got the capacity to spin off a background task, and that's great, and it's kind of cool, but you don't have all of these extra features that the dedicated queuing systems have built up over years and years and years and years and years. So kind of what happens if the email fails to send? You can't, where's the retry? There is no retry. So, someone might build, and there are, examples in the channels ecosystem where they built examples of a queuing system built on channels, which is built on ASCII, but it's recreating things which have been built in queuing systems before. It's not fundamentally changing the nature of the game. I think the advantages come in making requests out to third parties, which is something that we do a lot now, right? But if you can do that concurrently, you can reduce times. It comes with things like proxying servers. It comes with, handling more, in theory, handling more requests on a single threaded worker, on a single worker. But it's not going to eliminate the need for, say, queuing systems, I would say. It's not going to eliminate, a messaging bus or, all these other bits and pieces that people spin up when they start to scale.
I've asked Carlton that same question because it's similar but different. Like it's sort of the same, but they're going to be separate. Probably, eventually when it is all built out, you'll still need both, depending on what you need.
Yeah, I mean, I think the advantages right now are making requests out to third-party services, and then things like server-sent events or WebSocket communication that you can do. That's when it starts to make more sense. When you don't want to hold open a thread for a connection if you've got, you start scaling up WebSocket connections. You can't hold open a thread for every single one.
Yeah, that component of async excites me a lot because I don't know if you've looked into using Hotwire Turbo yet or no. A little bit,
yeah. But Go on, tell us about what you're excited about with Hotwire, because that's a hot topic, right? I mean, we've talked a lot on the show about HTMX, which is in the same ballpark.
Yeah, we had Carson on the episode before this.
Oh, nice. Yeah, I'll have to check that one out. But yeah, I mean, Hotwire Turbo, I guess it's similar in some regards, where it's just the ability to create something that feels similar to a single page application without having to actually go all in and create like an API backend and then create a separate application on the front end with, React or whatever you want to do. So, Hotwire Turbo just makes certain patterns, I guess, I don't want to say easy to create, but, easier to create than the alternative where, you can do partial page updates, but also you can send, incremental updates over a WebSocket connection. Like if you wanted to add an item to a list or something like that, if you had like, a chat example or a to-do item, you might want to add one item to the list or remove one item from the list. So yeah. But for that to work, you would need, WebSocket connection. So async would be very nice there instead of having to use, like a third-party WebSocket service or run an extra server on your own.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly the kind of use cases, right? They're sort of. Is there much point in just replacing the traditional request response cycle? No, not really. Like that works perfectly well for the vast majority of cases. But then there are these exciting things like the live. You used Elixir, you said, so you've looked at the Phoenix Live where they're using a WebSocket to update the HTML in the page there and then, and to have that kind of same ability in Python and in Flask and in Django, that's exciting.
Yeah. So I'm not like resident expert on this one, but I think there is a Hotwire Turbo library cooking right now for Django. Like someone in the community created that.
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah. Well, there's also there's a Django HTMX project that Adam Johnson, who's on the technical board, has created. So those things are coming in, and yeah, it's pretty exciting. To not have to write JavaScript yourself.
I think there's also
or not that much.
Yeah. So there's also the package called Django Unicorn, which is it's a magical full stack framework for Django. So it uses, I haven't actually dug into the implementation, but it uses WebSockets to then again do this live HTML updating.
Yeah, it's very cool stuff. We'll put a link to that in the show notes.
But anyway, these are the things that I think is exciting about async. Like and I don't know.
Switching gears slightly, Docker. So you have a course on Docker. Docker is something we talk about on this podcast. Maybe why create a course on Docker? Clearly, I guess your own journey into learning it was not as straight as it could be, and then you wanted to impart something better for people coming after you. Yeah.
So when it came to using Docker, I started really early on. It was like 2014, I want to say. Like Docker has already been. It was 1.0 by then. I think it was like 1.4 is when I started, but we're talking like ancient times in the tech universe. And back then, yeah, the ecosystem was so much different. Like even things like, Docker Desktop was many, many years from being created. Docker Toolbox didn't even exist. Like if you were on Windows or something like that and you wanted to run Docker, it was like you had to like actually roll your own VM, like a Linux VM, and install Docker directly on that. But yeah, you know how it is with tech projects. Like documentation might not be the best initially, but then slowly gets better over time. Like right now, Docker, their docs and stuff is in a great position. But for me, when it came to using Docker, yeah, it was just like I had trouble or not, basically pain points in, creating my own local development environment, specifically, I think it was with Rails at the time, where it was like you have to install Ruby and all these other things. And, there was a lot of moving parts. And, it's pretty comparable with Python as well. I mean, you do get Python installed by default, unlike most distros of Linux and Mac OS and stuff, but you still need to manage like a virtual environment. And then, maybe if you're using something like Postgres, you're pulling in the PG package, which is going to have like a C dependency that you need to install. Unless you use like that other package that's like not meant for production or whatever. But, getting that C dependency installed, if you're on Windows or Mac OS and Linux, that's a way different experience. And, besides just that one PG library, there's other packages as well that need C dependencies. And it's not even just your application too, right? Because it's like, well, okay, now I need to run Postgres. Okay, now I need to run Redis. Okay, now I'm running Unicorn, Celery, Redis, and Postgres, and maybe something else, maybe like an Elasticsearch or whatever your app happens to need. And before you know it, you're in this like hell of just like managing, how do I run all this stuff? How do I get it all installed? And then it's like, cool, I finally developed my app, 3 months, MVP is ready to go. Let me ship it to production. And then it's like, well, okay, I was running Windows or Mac OS, not Linux. Like, how the heck do I do all this on Linux? And now it's like you need to become an expert there and repeat all of those steps there. And it's like you finally get it out and shipped. Maybe you open source the product, and now you have other code contributors trying to come into the code base. And now suddenly you need documentation that's really good for everyone. And before you know it, like your whole life is taken over by just writing documentation that's going to get out of date to get people on board. But with Docker, now it's just like, okay, cool. You just run docker compose up -- build, wait 5 or 10 minutes, and like the whole thing is up and running. So for me, like, I don't know, like I'm not just saying like, oh, use Docker, it's cool, I have a course on it, go buy it. Like I use these things for many, many, many months or even like a year plus because it really helped me out. Like I really fundamentally believe like Docker or just containers in general is such a big, like it's one of those technology shifts that it's like, I'm very thankful to be a part of the time where I can actually use that stuff because I've used the alternatives and it wasn't good.
So Carlton still likes to do it his way, and he uses Docker when he has to, but he has not maybe experienced all those problems as much as you and I have.
I don't know. I've cried plenty of blood. But what would I say? I don't mean to put you on the spot, Carlton. I mean, I think we always end up turning it back into a dot conversation. I think that containers have a great use case, and it's exactly that: packaging up your dependencies in one thing and putting them on there. But if you can keep a grip on your dependencies and be able to manage them and know exactly what they are, it is. If you're deploying a Python app to a known environment, you don't need to add that extra layer necessarily all the time. I think that would be my kind of take is that, yeah, okay, brilliant. You want me to run something that uses Java, that's going in a Docker container, no problem, because I'm not installing all that and I'm not putting, getting into the hell there. But you want me to stick my little Django app in a container. Why? I can just run it locally. But I don't want to turn this into a Docker conversation. I hate Docker conversations. I mean, I hate it when you swing it round to me and go on, why don't you like Docker? I'm like, oh God, do we have to do that again?
No, I do that because I think it's important to not just, without thinking, jump on the train and say Docker all the way, and that there are trade-offs for sure. And if you don't need
it's a massive jump up in complexity. That's the thing. It's when you have complexity, yes, it can be simpler, but you trade off the getting the packages installed for building containers and managing all of that nonsense, and it's not time free. No,
I'll say one like immediate for sure trade-off is right now, at least at the time of recording this podcast, it is not the fastest thing in the world to build a new version of your Docker image when you just change one dependency. So like if you weren't using Docker and your requirements, a text file has, 20 things in it, and maybe like, maybe I need to install this one Django library or Flask library, whatever. With Docker, it's like you need to rebuild your image and it's going to invalidate the cache layer on your dependencies, and suddenly all 20 of those dependencies are going to be reinstalled instead of one. So like realistically, the turnaround time there is that maybe it takes like 5 or 6 minutes to build all of that, where if it were local outside of Docker, maybe 30 seconds. So, and those things add up.
And you can end up spending, basically all week optimizing your Docker build process. And it's like, at that point, it's like, hang on, wasn't this meant to be much simpler?
Well, I do want to add, we have in the notes, you have a Docker Django example repo where your take on how to structure all this, which I think is very helpful to folks. But the thing I really want to talk about is our last major topic is deployment, which Docker ties into that. But you have thoughts. Carlton's been working on button.dev, which you can sign up for, which is a simpler Django deployment story. So maybe, Nick, deployment, with or without Docker, how do you like doing deployment these days? And let's just have a discussion about, Flask, how do you like to deploy it? Because deployment is always pretty individual.
Right. So I'm a really big advocate of keeping that. It's funny that I say this now, like keeping things simple, until they don't need to be simple. So for me, I'm a big fan of just using Docker Compose as much as I can. So in dev, in CI, and in prod, I'm totally cool just doing a Docker Compose up, -d or whatever, and get everything up and running on one server, like one VPS, doesn't matter which provider you happen to use, because I really don't mind the idea of having like 3 seconds of downtime if I'm deploying my application like 3 times a week. And even, I've got some clients, I can't get into like super details, but like, these are clients making like $80,000, $90,000 a month, running it on a single $40 a month VPS. And yes, they have like 5 seconds of downtime when they deploy their application. It's not the biggest deal in the world, at least for the types of applications they're building, right? It's not like a medical device. No one's going to die if someone gets like a 502, like back in found for Nginx errors. But yeah. But on top of that though, eventually, maybe if your application grows to a certain size, or maybe you have an organization where, you don't mind throwing money at the problem and you just have some hard requirements because maybe you're now managing like bigger clients and like downtime's unacceptable. Yeah, maybe then you can transition into something like Kubernetes or a container orchestration tool that'll just help you minimize downtime. I'm still on the fence of Kubernetes, where it's like, it's almost a meme at this point, where the complexity of that is like ridiculously high. But if you keep it pretty minimal, it's not that bad of a solution, in my opinion, to get something up and running where you can just load balance an application, get 3 or 4 copies of those running, do a rolling restart, 0 downtime, 200 lines of YAML and you're done. But yeah, there's a lot of ramp up time to get that to that point. So that's basically how I progress most of my own stuff. And, if I were to develop my own SaaS app and actually ship it, it's probably just going to be on one VPS. Maybe I'll use a managed Postgres server, so I don't need to deal with that. It also makes it easier to keep the state off my server, which is a good idea in general, in case I just want to maybe do a 0 downtime server upgrade, like upgrading from Ubuntu 20 LTS to whatever the next one's going to be in a couple of years. I don't have to worry about like migrating my database data from a different server. I can just, flip it over at the DNS level, stuff like that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, hosted DB all day long.
Yep.
I can't agree more with what you've just said. Like, it's perfect. Like, keeping it simple until you need more. That was the phrase you used, and it's exactly right. It's people not for one. I think the sort of the blog sphere, the tech blog sphere, kind of gaslights us a little bit. It's like, no, you've got to have this, you've got to have that, and you start to doubt your own, sanity. Oh, is it okay if I do this simple thing? Yeah, it really is okay if you do that simple thing until it's not. And okay, that moment where you restart your application server, if you're not switching it to another running one, there will be, potential of drop requests, but meh, it probably doesn't matter.
Yeah. And if you want to get really, really fancy pants about that, have you ever heard of OpenResty before?
Oh yeah, that's a framework built into Nginx, right?
Yeah. So I don't want to get too deep into it because I'm not a professional on it, but think of it as like Nginx Deluxe. Like, it's an open source version of Nginx that has certain extensions enabled, one of them being Lua extensions. And once you have Lua extensions available, you can start doing some really, really interesting things, such as like, imagine you have one instance of your app running and no load balancer. So, you restart your app and it's going to be 5 seconds of downtime, however long it takes your application to boot up. But if you're using OpenResty with Lua, you can actually script a solution to where instead of having those requests be served as like a 502 backend because it's down, you can have Nginx queue those requests up in order. And then the user, like endpoint of view user, is just going to have like a busy mouse cursor on the site. It's going to look like the page is hanging, but they're not going to get that 502 backend not found. And then when your application comes back up, it is going to release those items from the queue and just serve them as if it's basically 0 downtime. And I think that's such a fantastic solution for the one server deploy without introducing like massive like Kubernetes or load balance or auto scaling groups or all crazy stuff like that.
Yeah, no, that's a good idea, because one thing I like to do is just use an application load balancer in front, because I think it's good. It's like a managed Postgres, right? I think it's money well spent, because you can just sort of spin up the new one and just change it at the load balancer level, and it's kind of nice. But exactly, yeah, you can configure Nginx to hold those requests.
So the load balancer approach is definitely awesome, but I don't know if you've experienced this firsthand, but it also becomes a little bit more difficult to reason about your app if you are under the universe to where V1 of your app and V2 of your app can be running at the same time. Like suddenly you need to be very careful with your database migrations to make sure that they're compatible with both versions of your app running. Like there's a lot of can of worms that you need to be aware of. I'm sure you know that.
Yeah, no, I mean, that migrations is one of the great issues. Like, so people always... One of the great advantages of containerization is that you can roll back. You just deploy the last image, but you can't roll back a migration, right? So it's like, because once you've migrated it, if you roll back to the other version, it hasn't got the migration, so you can't revert the migration. It's like, no, there's only, once you start changing your database structure, there's only forwards, and that's just a difficult topic, I think. I think that's,
oh yeah, suddenly it's like you want to rename a column and it's like 17 steps to do it with no downtime. Yeah.
No, I mean, there's a reason why people make a living specializing in that kind of more difficult thing, though.
Mm-hmm. So Nick, your deployment story, that sounds like most consultants I know, in that you've found a deployment story that works for you, and then you can apply it through a lot of projects. One of the cool things, so Carlton has this button.dev that I mentioned, because, for someone who wants the benefit of that without all the years of experience and client work it takes to get there, where he's kind of rolling this all up into something that, someone who's new to Django or Flask, who wants the benefit of that and just wants it to work, can kind of have it, a layer on top of AWS to start. Right, Carlton?
Yeah, so I mean, it's so btn.dev is, the idea is exactly that. It's like, look, you want a simple story, here it is, you've got it, and you don't have to. The trouble is, you go in, fire up the AWS console, right, and you're going to get an anxiety attack because the 2,000 services that appear. For a mortal getting started, that's not an approachable way. And I know, there are other options like DigitalOcean and, Roku and things like that. But, deployment comes up week after week on this show, and it's always like, I've been working on this 10 years and I finally got it mastered, or, finally got something that works for me. It's like, that's too far from where the beginner is, or from where I just want to get my app online, right? I just want to get my app online.
Deployment's like the great thing that it's hard. It seems harder than it should be, right? There's like just a total gap from a completely hosted, maybe a Heroku thing, to AWS expert. But you've made that journey, Nick, right? So like, I'm just curious, what was that like for you? Like, how did you have to do that, or what was the process that forces someone to spend all these years, learning about the ins and outs of deployment?
Yeah, I guess it just came out of necessity. So it's like I had this application on my dev box. Now I need it to be running on the interwebs, like on a domain name that I can access that everyone else can also. Like, how do I get there? And it was a very long journey, probably like 7 years, I want to say. But it wasn't like 7 years of like 40 hours a week just focused on like learning stuff. It was basically just like, okay, cool, my app is ready, let me deploy. Okay, what needs to be done there? Okay, so what cloud hosting provider do I use? DigitalOcean, Linode, AWS, like there's 100 different ones that you can choose from. And now it's like, okay, cool, I have the host, or I have the hosting provider. Now, like, what operating system should I use? Should it be Ubuntu, Debian, something else? And then that's just like, that's like a 3-day rabbit hole now, where you're reading like 15 different blog posts, like 20 YouTube videos, trying to like, but it's tricky because you're not an expert in the thing yet. So it's like you have to cross-reference this stuff and just see like the common ground. Like, okay, this thing was repeated like 7 times. This is probably a good choice. Okay, Debian, let's roll with that, or Ubuntu LTS, whatever, great. And it's like, then you just need to learn more about just how Linux works, right? It's like, just understand, at least at the very basics, like how do I lock down a server with SSH? Like, what about port forwarding and firewall rules and stuff like that? Should I use IP tables or something else? Like, and then cloud hosting providers have their own version of that on top. Yeah, so it's just like rabbit hole after rabbit hole, and honestly, it's almost never ending, depending on how deep you want to go. But like, long story short, I went through that process, and once you go through the process and you set up your first server, then it's like, well, how can I automate it next time? Okay, cool. I'm going to write my own documentation and here's all the steps to do it. And then you're like, wait, no. Let me just make it into a script because that's way better than documentation because now the script actually works. And then it's like, well, but there's so many like edge cases and like if conditions and blah, 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 blah. Maybe I should look into something else. Oh, there's configuration management. That's actually a thing. And then it's like you learn about using Chef or Puppet or Ansible or Salt or 10 other ones. And then that's another rabbit hole of years, by the way. Ultimately, I ended up choosing Ansible, by the way. And I've written like 10,000 lines of Ansible YAML over the years. Like, I don't want to go super deep into Ansible, but configuration management, it's a ways for you to be able to run, like, let's say one command, and then suddenly your whole server is set up ready to go based on, YAML that you've written. Also, by the way, Ansible is written in Python, so that's kind of cool too. And then after that, it's like eventually you get to the point where now you have the server provisioned. It's like, what's the next step? Like, maybe I want to run this on AWS, but it's like I need to set up like IAM policies and security groups and EC2 instances and RDS. It's like, well, maybe is there a way to automate that? And then you're like, well, there's a thing called Terraform. Now I can do like infrastructure as code, like Ansible, but for my infrastructure. And then like before you know it, you get all this code written and you're like 5 years into it. And finally it's like, I can set up a single server now in an automated way. Cool. Like it took a while to get there, but it was a journey worth going down, I think, because one, I kind of like that stuff, like the app side of thing. Like most of my contracting work now is actually just more focused on that. So I actually found I sort of like that, but I understand there's so many devs. I think I'm a minority and most of them are just like, man, I have this thing in my dev box, just get it up on the internet. I don't care how it gets there. So I appreciate services like that.
That's more me. So like, I wish we had the video because Carlton was nodding to everything you just said there. Because you two can relate in a way that I can't fully. Like I have done it a little bit, but I have not done the years that the two of you have on it.
I remember.
I'm just like, just someone else solve it for me. Like I've got enough to deal with at the app level.
I remember spinning up my first VPS and it was like, oh yeah, I've got a VPS and oh God, what's the difference between all these, between the different Linux distributions? And I had no idea what the difference was between them. And
when you get hacked, right? Mine was hacked right away. Like within, 20 minutes on Linode, I think,
okay.
I got a thing being like, your thing is spamming something, it's insecure. And I was like, why would you let me set something up that is, unsafe? So it's a very scary thing.
Yeah. And
very frustrating thing. Less scary, more just like, how does anyone do this?
But it's literally days of reading tutorials on, stuff. And
so I have no desire to go to where the two of you have gone.
And then there's like a whole nother thing too. It's like you have everything up and running. And now there's like all this like post deploy steps. Like, well, how should I keep my database backed up? Like, should it be every 3 hours, every 6 hours, every 2 days? Like, there's a lot of things to keep.
Yeah. How many nines do you want to have for your uptime?
Mm-hmm.
Well, anyway, so maybe, I don't know, is that a future course from you, Nick, about all those steps and everything else, or is that?
Yeah, that's the current course that is cooking now. Basically, just like deploying to production, but it's going to be focused on the individual or small teams who they don't want like 1,000 node Kubernetes cluster. It's like, let's just get this up and running on one server using Docker Compose, but let's not skimp out on making this like production ready, right? So we're still going to have best practices around like file uploads will go through to S3 or some compatible object storage. Going to be using environment variables. Like it'll make it easy to transition to using something like Kubernetes if you wanted to in the future.
That sounds super.
It's hard to call something truly production ready or professional because that's like decades of a career. Like I have that a little bit. I have the Django for Professionals book, which is a big step up from my other two. But some of the feedback I get is, well, it doesn't go, into all these things. And it's like, well, that's a thousands and thousands of page book that nobody could write and maintain. But there's that. So there's that, that slope. And one of the things I try to do, and I think we do in this podcast, is try to give a sense of like, what is the context of production ready? And it's like, there's a reason why Dropbox has so many engineers, right? It's mainly ops. Mm-hmm. Same with any other big company, because it's, like we could all build an Instagram clone over a weekend, but at their scale, then you need a lot of other things. It's not so to the point of, we often say Django is really more of a front end thing, actually, in terms of, the back end is this deep, endless abyss of configuration and uptime.
It's funny though, because it's like finishing developing your application. It's almost like that's where the journey begins. Like, and you're not done yet. Like now it just starts.
Yeah.
Well, and for me personally, like I am of the opinion, like that's enough for me to focus on. So I'm happy to pay button.dev or Heroku or whatever. And if I get to the point where my bill is more than a DevOps engineer, like, great, that's a problem I want to have. I'll pay whatever, but that's a long, long way off. Like, I think people also think that they need to jump to that until they're, yeah, as you said, you can run $1 million business on a $40 box.
Yeah.
A lot of people do, actually.
Yeah.
I think that's the sort of thing, is that the temptation is to over engineer to begin with. Like, you build something that you could deploy 100 times the application that you've actually got on what you've provisioned, and that's all just wasted.
Totally.
Yeah, it's like you got a UI problem. Instead, you increase the uptime, 0.001%, because that's doable and feels better. That's sort of an engineer's curse a little bit.
Definitely, yeah. It's super easy to get lost in the woods there.
Carlton, do you have any other questions for Nick? We're coming up on time.
Well,
what else?
I mean,
should we...
we did. I had imagined we were going to talk about Flask a little bit more than we did, but so I don't know if it would work to cut back there at all, or if we've got anything to discuss.
Well, Nick, what can we do to bring you over to Django? How do we convert you? Like, when you from where you sit, when you look at the two ecosystems, what kind of keeps you in Flask as opposed to something with more guardrails? Because a lot of people are in that boat too. So I'm just sort of curious, the Django community, what does a Flask developer think of Django?
So I don't know enough about Django to, like, I've never built like a quote unquote production ready, like large scale Django app. So I can't give a perfect like comparison. But for me, like when I got started doing all this web development stuff in the early days of PHP, it was really cool just to have PHP standard library. I literally didn't install a single dependency ever. So I ended up rolling my own stuff. And, you think about that and you look back and you're like, that's horrible though. Like, why would you put in all that effort when other people have solved the problem way better than you will ever be able to solve it? And it's been vetted by like, 1 million other people. Of course, there's nothing better than that. But in a funny way, in the back of my mind, it's always like, well, I created this mess, but it's my mess. Like, I know exactly where to go when things go wrong. Like, I still have like these like 11-year-old PHP apps that for other like ancient clients where, it's everything bad, right? It's that one PHP file that's like 6,500 lines, and there's like PHP and there's like SQL statements in line there, probably not even like secure, but it still somehow works and no one ever got hacked. But yeah, I don't know. So Flask is kind of neat for me because it's like, it sort of gives me that feeling of like, I can actually do things. I don't want to say like my way or the highway, but like I can do things a certain way. And maybe it's not the best way ever, but it's like when I need to go back there in 2 years and maintain something, it's like I know exactly where I'm going. Now, that's not a super fair comparison because you can just learn the Django way of doing things. And now you don't even need to worry about making decisions. You can actually just start putting your code, your business logic where Django tells you to put it and do all the stuff. And, there's definitely value in that. Well, I see a little head shake in there because it is a video call, but Don, do you want to expand on that one?
Yeah. No, I was just going to say, I agree with that. Even within Django, so we have on the Django forum, there's a topic about where to put the logic in Django. So even with Django's guardrails, there's a couple places you could put it. And I think there's general agreement, but it depends. So, so for example, many people would put it in the view. You can also put it in the model. There's model managers. You definitely don't want to put it in the templates. But there's a lot of subjectivity around optimizing that, depending on how you cache it. I think generally, and Carlton, you're the expert. I would say generally logic starts in the view, and if you can, you want to move it to the models. But it sort of depends. But that's the general pattern I find myself getting into.
Yeah.
What do you say, Mr. Django fellow? What's the canonical answer?
The canonical answer for me is that the view is for turning HTTP requests into HTTP responses. So if the logic is to do with that, it belongs in the view. But if it's like, I don't know, sorting, something alphabetically. Yeah,
right?
Then you want to probably tuck that in your model and have either a model method or a manager method to, that encapsulate it. So, and like if you've got a manager method that's responsible for creating an instance and some dependent objects and all the rest, and what's that going to take in it? That's going to take validated data that came through the form layer. And so, logic about data validation, that's going to live in the form layer. So for me, there are kind of places, but then within it, it's like, well, do I use a model method, or do I a manager method, or do I, yes, there's room for, lots of different approaches there. I like what you were saying, Nick, about building it yourself. It's like driving a Corvette, right? It's a manual shift. You can feel like you have more control or more fun or more freedom. Like the thing that came to mind was, the Starlet and Fast API that people are, getting into now, for that same sort of reason. It's small, and they think, I can bolt together my little thing. I don't know if you've used those frameworks as well.
I haven't, but I mean, on the flip side, right? There's still a ridiculous amount of value in having very strong opinions made for you, because that just makes it way easier for people to operate almost as like people instead of an individual person, right? So if once you solve the problem a certain way with Django, it's very well documented. Like everyone can benefit from that standard or opinion that was created. It just makes it a lot easier to learn the framework, even though there's like maybe more stuff to learn, and it's not just a single file or whatever. But it's much easier to keep everyone basically on the same page, onboard new people into the framework, or especially like a big application, right? If you are a company and you're expanding and now you have a couple of employees, getting them up to speed on a Django code base is probably going to be a lot easier than a random Flask one, because it's just going to look more like the docs, I guess, versus an individual, like whoever the CTO decided to make the Flask app.
I think as well in a Django app, there's a tendency for it to go wrong in the same ways as well. So there'll be too much logic in the view, and it'll be like, why are you doing this in the view for? That's fine though, because you can move this bit that can go into the form layer, and that bit there can go in, and it's kind of like predictable that that's where the problem will be.
Yeah. Well, you can also, so Carlton has a talk from most recent DjangoCon, and I have a blog post and a project on, you can have a single file Django project. So Django can do what Flask can do. We have a whole thing on that, but I'll put those in the show notes, right?
I don't think it's a competition though. Like I was so pleased to see the announcement that the Flask 2 was coming, and that it was going to have the async and all the rest, because I didn't know that was on the cards, and it was like, yes, thank you, that's brilliant, because it's really important that Flask is able to move forward and have the new shiny features. I think that's it's vital for not vital. Frameworks come and frameworks go, but for something with as much weight in the community as Flask has, for it to, if it hadn't been able to move forward, it would have been a really sad loss, I think. And so
sure. No, I'm a big fan of, I don't want to say like competition, but I feel like it brings the best to everyone when you have multiple choices where, Flask is good, Django is good, Rails is good. Like it's not all or nothing. Like there only could be one winner, right? There's 3 winners there. So
yeah, and the frameworks will learn from each other, right? It's like, that's interesting what so-and-so is doing over there. Let's see what we can do over here that's similar. And, in the front end world, we've talked today about Turbo and HTMX and, various approaches to live. That's quite an exciting area. And there's all these different things experimenting with different options. And the result of it be 5 years' time, there'll be mature and established stories for all the frameworks there.
Right. Then I can sit back and create my server rendered applications with sprinkles of JavaScript here and there, and then I'm a very happy person.
Yeah. I think it's getting there. Yeah. I mean, Carlton, so Django as a micro framework was Carlton's talk, and it's, I think, 10 lines of code. So it's not quite as quick as Flask Hello World, but you can get kind of close. It's really a question of where you put things. But we had, maybe as a concluding thought, we had DHH of Rails fame on, and a lot of the discussion was, why is Django and Rails, and I guess Laravel, why are there so few batteries included frameworks? And he made the analogy of like, those are trucks you build out of Legos, whereas Flask and others are a bag of Legos you dump on the floor. So it sort of depends on how you want to spend your time. But I have to think that part of it too is it's these full stack frameworks or these batteries included, they're a little bit all or nothing. You can add Flask to a Rails app if you want to. So in that way, it's easier to kind of add things on, especially in a larger company where you have lots of teams, and it's perceived to be easier to add on a micro framework as opposed to Django, though you can also do it with Django. But I'm curious, I guess, if you see this. I see this a lot of times as, oh yeah, we use Flask because it's like to sprinkle things on to something that may not even be in Python to begin with, but it kind of works quickly for a specific case.
So do you mean like spinning up a separate microservice that maybe a couple hundred lines or whatever to do some functionality?
Yeah. If you have it, and it could be, whatever other framework or programming language, or even just in a larger thing, it's easier for a team to just spin that up and, kind of glue it on, as opposed to, if you're a solo developer, you'd have it all within one roof. It's like once you go off the guardrails, you're kind of fully off.
Right.
Or at least anecdotally, I see that. And so that sort of makes sense to me about part of why Flask has so much popularity is it's used in that way, in a way that Django is not. People are less likely to add in Django later on to something.
So you're saying like in the Django ecosystem, you're seeing more people just build like single monolithic applications where everything is in the single Django app? Like not necessarily like Django apps, like you can separate your application at the application level, but I mean like services.
Yeah, I mean, just Django is generally not used as a micro framework in the same way that Flask is, though it could be. But part of that is the documentation. Part of that is just how it's being used, how it's presented. Nice. I feel like that's not a great. That doesn't sound so great when I say it again. But
I get that feeling. Somebody, I don't know, a data analyst say is, they've got their pandas data and they want to somehow just get it online, and a bit of googling, and it's like, oh yeah, the Flask example makes sense quickly. Right? So I can just knock it up in Flask. If it's only a couple of endpoints, it's easily done. It's there, bam, and then they're a Flask user, and then carry on, and this is nice, and that's fine. That's super.
Yeah, I see that type of pattern too.
Well, Nick, any concluding things you want to mention or plug as we round out the show?
Let's see, plug wise. So I do write a weekly blog post at nickjanetakis.com. I also have a YouTube channel there as well, where most of those blog posts have been videos for like the last year. But yeah, besides that, there's like a list of courses on that page. There's always the runninginproduction.com podcast, where half the episodes are Django, so you might want to check that one out. And
yeah, and we put we put, I think, hopefully all of them in the Django News newsletter.
Oh yeah,
there's a podcast section, which is basically this one and yours, and a couple times there's some other ones, but those are kind of the two main ones.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, by the way, because I always see like an uptick in traffic when that newsletter hits. So thank you.
Yeah, no, yeah. Well, and if anyone, I doubt it, but if anyone listening doesn't know, there is a Django-News newsletter that's weekly that I do with Jeff Triplett, and trying to promote the small but valuable community of Django and people pumping out good content, because it can be hard to find on your own. So this isn't so much a plug, but it's more of a request. So Carlton, if you ever want to come on that Running in Production show to talk about button.dev, like how you built it and deploy it, would love to have you on.
Okay, yeah. So it's DjangoCon coming up next. This show will probably come out after that, and then but the next phase after that is Buttons launch time. So
yeah, marketing.
Really,
you should
marketing. I don't. Yeah, I do shiver.
I'll just come on and talk for you. I'll say all the positive things, Carlton. You can underplay it.
Yeah. Okay, I'll underplay it. That's fine. I'm still in building phase. I just got to get through DjangoCon, and then that's the next thing. So I'd love to come on and talk about it, Nick. Thank you.
So one last quick thing. So doing the podcast, Nick, what have been your takeaways? Right? 'Cause sometimes people say, oh, "Yeah, podcast would be fun to do." Like how much work is it, and what have you gotten out of doing it? Because you've done it for a while now.
Yeah, I started in October 2019. So I'm at like episode 85-ish. And yeah, it is a lot of work, to be honest. So I don't outsource any of the process, because you end up in like a chicken egg type of scenario where the episodes aren't sponsored because the audience isn't big enough. So, you kind of have to put the burden on yourself to do all of the work. So it's like finding the guests that you want to have on, then recording the show, scheduling the show, etc. And then it's like editing the show, creating show notes and stuff like that. So I'm probably putting in like 5 or 6 hours a week on this one, like end to end, to produce one episode, assuming I don't have to try too hard to find a guest. But, it's not just like a monetary gain for me or trying to get a monetary gain out of it. I kind of like the process of just the interview part. So if I can outsource everything else and just do like show up for an hour and then be done, that'd be amazing. Hopefully one day I'll get to that point through sponsors. But yeah, if you are thinking about starting a podcast, don't be very aware of how much time you're going to be spending, especially if you don't have prior knowledge of like video editing and, or audio editing. And so I had a big background of that already because I did I literally recorded like 500 videos for my courses before that. So yeah, there could be a ramp up time. Like when I talk about rabbit holes, like the audio stuff is also never ending. So
before our first episode, we must have spent 2 months trying to get it all right, just being able to record a simple chat.
But the takeaway overall of the show, I'm really happy with it because I like talking to someone new every week, and you get a really good perspective of what people are actually doing, not just talking about. Because yeah, if you're just on Hacker News all the time, it's always like Kubernetes this, Kubernetes that, make this thing do this, and yeah. But really, at the end of the day, there's so many people out there just using Heroku, using maybe a service like button.dev when it's available. We're just throwing up one server, and it actually works. At small scale and medium scale as well.
Exactly right. This podcast came out of DjangoCon and the hallway conversations and thinking how can we keep that going and share that with other people. And so that's why it's a chat about Django. Great. So we have links to everything in the show notes. Do check out Nick's podcast, Nick's site, Nick's courses. Thank you for coming on, Nick.
Thanks
a lot for having me.
All right, everyone. We're at djangochat.com, chat Django on Twitter, and we'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.